Okay, this is the third and final lecture about Joe Haldeman's Forever War. And as you can see from this table of contents, it's a bit unrealistic here about all the stuff I'm planning on packing into this thing. So this lecture does run a little long, and some of these issues I take up very briefly. And anyway, there's a lot of it's just a lot of sort of odds and ends to cover. I ended last week or last day by talking about armor, and one of the things that we've seen in this course is the focus on the body and body politics, and whether it is Billy in a rail car or Joker and the squad, the Lusthog squad, being owned and operated by Gunnery Sergeant Hartman, or Joe Bonham, or the men in 300, or Mandrake, who is a prisoner of Ripper's precious bodily fluids, and so on, or the colonial Marines who are trying to avoid impregnation. All are prisoners, the same way that the elite grunts are in their Forever War. And so on page 49, Mandela says, "We were under no circumstances to allow ourselves to be taken alive, however, and the decision wasn't up to us. One special pulse from the battle computer and you'd be nothing but a rapidly expanding, very hot plasma." So the suit is the thing that keeps you alive, and you must wear it in these enormously hostile conditions, but it also is a bomb, basically, and can end your particular universe. Because, as with the original design of the suits, anything that's going to power something like that has to have an enormous power pack. In this case, it has to have some kind of, yeah. And so the suit exchanges power for life. I mean, that's the deal. Basically, you give up your life, it gives you power, and you lose control, basically, over kind of everything else, really. And without the suit, the body starts to look I guess just too weak to survive. I guess that's the point. And so on page 21, this is what happens. And again, there's a lot. If I use a car to go to the sort of car example, if you're driving, you're on the highway, and let's say you're driving a long distance, and you maybe drive for 2 or 3 days, it's very strange to get out of the car and stop driving, because everything you've gotten used to has been in the context of the car, the vehicle. And now not to be in the vehicle seems odd and unusual, unreal in some way. And you perceive the body differently as well, where the car, you are used to going at a certain, you just settle into this new pattern. It's not unlike the way the body gets used to, say, being in a boat on a lake. And if you've been in, a boat on a lake for a day, you've been out, say, in a rowboat, and it's a bit choppy, and you come in, and your body's like, oh, you lie down, and your body is still on the water. It's like, yeah, that's right. So on page 21, Mandela says, "We were allowed to unsuit 97 naked chickens squirming out of bright green eggs." So here's this concept that the suit is really the beginning of a new world, or another world. Okay. So we have a very different image of the human beings than we had if we, say, compare this to Top Gun, with the sort of beautiful young men who are all beefcakes, playing volleyball. This is not that, right? this makes the body look more sort of like a mollusk inside a shell. And this concept of the body in wartime as becoming something which is totally foreign or estranged from the self is generally new to industrial warfare. I mean, this is you really see it in World War One and after that. And so on page 175, when the two of them, when Mandela and when Mary Gay and William are on Heaven, they are trying to basically, enjoy their lives. And he says, but there was a pall over it, since it was obvious that we weren't out of the army, just pieces of broken equipment they were fixing up to throw back into the fray, on 175. Now, this concept of the soldier as a piece of equipment that is sort of going to be used up is something that most soldiers talk about. This concept that the body essentially is something that the individual will not be able to take back from the state is something that many soldiers arrive at when they realize that they have very few options, basically. And the military is very good about understanding the different things that a human being can do to try to get out of serving, basically, especially once you're on the battlefield. And everything will point you back to the battlefield. The military, the medical establishment will, the religious establishment will, and so on. Nobody's going to give you a way out. So, if we go back to World War One and to a book by John Dos Passos, who was a famous early modernist, an American writer, who wrote, amongst other things, a book called Three Soldiers, and it is about the sort of the outcome, what happens to three different soldiers, basically, American soldiers, and one of them is wounded quite badly, and not dreadfully, but just he's wounded. He's got to be sent back to a field hospital, and in France and in Belgium, but especially in France, these field hospitals were usually, or very often, were large buildings that were taken over by the state. So they might be old aristocratic houses. The same thing happened in Britain, where field hospitals were, especially in World War II, but also in World War One, because they just had so many people to deal with. Suddenly, there's no way the hospitals they had could deal with all these people who were sick and who had been wounded and so on. And so they, and some were never going to leave hospital. Right, that was the point about World War One, was that the people survived because the medical science had gotten to be good enough to keep people alive. But that was it. They weren't going to be able to function outside the hospital. Well, what the French did was they seconded, basically, these old aristocratic homes, manorial, these mansions that exist. They still do exist in the countryside. And these are massive places. I mean, they would have been, they date back to basically the to the 1700s in some cases, that is to the 18th century. So they're Napoleonic era, basically lords' homes. And they took those places over and made them into hospitals. And so what you have to imagine are these huge, massive, beautiful places, which are repurposed as hospitals. And they have those, the ceilings are 30 feet high, and they've got parquet floors, and, gorgeous, But, down on the ground, you've got a bunch of iron beds, which are filled with men who have been shot up, and nurses in white, and this is where the white woman tending them. So in Three Soldiers, one of the soldiers is is sent back to one of these field hospitals to recover. He's so badly injured, and they obviously want to keep him in the war, and that's the sense is that is this person useful to us still? We'll keep them, or are we going to send them home? And some people were just sent home. They was like, no, the army was like, we can't use them anymore. They're useless to us, which meant that they probably weren't functional. So anyway, this soldier says, he felt at home in that spacious hall, built for wide gestures and stately steps. So these gestures and steps would be the kind of gestures you see, when a lord comes in, with this morning coat on, with the pompadour and and with the sort of making these, they're lords we're talking about. So this is, and stately steps would be the, it's like the kind of dance you would have, which you'll see in historical films, the same era as sort of Jane Austen. Yeah. In which all the little routine of the army seemed unreal, and the wounded men discarded automatons, broken toys laid away in rows. And later on, about 20 pages later on in the novel, Dos Passos comes back around to the soldier and his experience. His limbs felt heavy, his mind was permeated with dusty stagnation, like the stagnation of old garrets and lumber rooms, where amid superannuated bits of machinery and cracked, grimy crockery lie heaps of broken toys. So there's this sense that the individual has just been thrown away and is no longer of any use. Now, Haldeman is a fan of modernist writing. Specifically, he's a Hemingway scholar, and he writes about Hemingway a couple of times. He actually wrote a novel which incorporates Hemingway as a character, called The Hemingway Hoax. And he's a fan. He's a member of a society, what is called the Hemingway Society, and they travel around the world, going to places that Hemingway wrote about and where he stayed, and so on. And so he's a very careful reader of Hemingway, and very interested in Hemingway, and also of the Jazz Age writers who surrounded Hemingway, sometimes referred to as the Exiles by Malcolm Cowley, because these were people who went to France in World War I and they never really came back. I mean, they, to some extent, were informed by that. So Hemingway is one, Fitzgerald is one, Gertrude Stein, Alice B. Toklas, because of Gertrude Stein. And there are a whole number of other people who Cowley includes as being, or yes, it includes E. Cummings, John Dos Passos, who went to France and participated in the war before America was actually in the war as a shooting war. And so what they did was that most of them went and worked for the ambulance services, because there were private ambulance services. And so they signed on, and this is one of the most dangerous jobs you could possibly have, which was to run around the battlefield and to try to collect people who were still alive. And you didn't carry a gun because you'd get killed. And the notion that essentially people would be allowed to, with a Red Cross brassard, that people would be allowed to go onto the battlefield and collect the living this was the end of that idea. I mean, there was no, after World War I, that was off. So I quoted these passages to Haldeman, who is deeply familiar with Dos Passos, but had not read Three Soldiers. And so I was very interested when I came across it, because I was doing some research. And I said, check this out, listen to this. And he said, he was absolutely thrilled. It was just amazing. We were sitting, talking, and I had the recorder on, and he said, I'll be damned. How about that? I never read that. It was just amazing. And in other words, so when Haldeman goes to use the trope, broken toy, he developed it on his own. It just reappears because it's the kind of thing which the soldier comes to. So have a look at these these images by Marvano, So this is Mark. I was mentioning this. This is Mark van Oppen, Mar Van O, and his adaptation of the Forever War for bande dessinée, European graphic novels. Okay. Wounded plaything, then, the body that has been picked up by some enormous force, like a child, and thrown against a wall, um, gets that it has been treated badly. And it has presentiments of that. That is, it sees this coming. On page 14, the first sergeant moved like a heavy machine with lots of ball bearings, and when the door hissed shut, he swiveled ponderously to face us and said, "At ease, sit down," in a surprisingly gentle voice. He sat on the table in the front room. It creaked, but held. And the words in this passage are quite ominous. They're machinic. The sergeant moves like a heavy machine. Everything about it is sort of the door hisses shut. The sergeant swivels ponderously. Steel finally meets steel. And this is the kind of thing which you would see, and Paul Verhoeven again, goes after Starship Troopers. And he really gets that, and he really gets the fact that Starship Troopers is fundamentally a fascist text. That he will also get the idea of the body in something like RoboCop. So to have a look at that.
Oh, thank you. I'm not hungry. You may not like what you're going to see.
It's really good to see you again, Murphy.
The sense of separation then is going to be natural. That if you're a toy, you're not real anymore. And on page 60, Mandela says, "I felt if I could only touch her, Mary Gay, I could drain off the sadness like ground wire draining current. But we were each trapped in our own plastic world." And interestingly, that he doesn't say, if I could touch her, I could make contact, I could, I could feel the warmth of her skin or something like that. It's like, no, there's this electric image, right? I would drain off the sadness like a ground wire draining current. So it's an electric scientific engineering metaphor. That's only on page 60, right? And page 60, and there's a little sort of cluster of this kind of anxiety that the individual has. "I dreamed that I was a machine, mimicking the functions of life, creaking and clanking my clumsy way through the world, people too polite to say anything but giggling behind my back. And the little man who sat inside my head, pulling the levers and clutches and watching the dials, he was hopelessly mad and storing up hurts for the day." So it is hard to see how you can see where this is what the soldier has got to come back from. This is the when we talk about PTSD, the soldier faces the task of coming out of this particular worldview of understanding the body this way, and some don't. I mean, obviously, they just may never